He wanted to add one more sugar cube into his coffee. What was preventing him was that there was only one sugar cube on the tray, and the lady who served the coffees hadn't put any into hers. It was hard to imagine not putting an extra sugar cube into his cup. Maybe tasting it as coffee with one sugar in it would be enough to turn him around, he thought. His hand slowly went to the teaspoon inside his cup and then started crushing the sugar with it, slowly mixing it around in a circle. To complete contrary to his hope, the mixing of the sugar only sparked his desire, need even perhaps, for the extra cube even more. The thoughts inside his head started forming complex shapes which all suggested that he take the sugar cube and end this cycle, because if he didn't, it was going to continue. It was as if the teaspoon was his desire and the cup was his brain, and he was stirring it, causing them to mix into each other even further. So, what is the sugar then? Sugar was just something nice, and he simply desired more of it. He made sure there was no eye contact between him and the lady as he was going to do it. Some sort of a short tremble lifted his head into reaching the cube. Suddenly it was done. One more movement, and then a nice, satisfying sound came from the coffee, his coffee as the sweet thing dropped into it. Its color changed nicely and swiftly to a softer tone, a nice and warm brownish color. Glancing at the lady's black coffee made him appreciate the color even more for a second.
I'm very thankful for this, you know.
Lady's voice slightly startled him. She repeated herself.
What you are doing. Really. Thank you.
It was easier to listen than to say something that could give her the courage to continue. It was quite apparent that she was lacking that in whatever she was going to say.
I know this doesn't seem like the right thing to do, but this has been my life for the last 22 years. I honestly can't find the strength to continue anymore. All I have been doing for the past year was searching for that strength. But, it's just, I can't do it anymore.
He opened his mouth, but all that came out was a weird sound. A slow swallowing of a dry spit, followed by a quick breath, managed to clean out the rasp. I would be the last one to judge you, believe me. I have walked the same road many, many years ago and it's rough. I know it. Someone who hasn't done it could not really understand it. I understand it, and it's okay. She stared into his eyes for a second or two after he finished his sentence. Even though he wasn't God or anything, his insight on the matter and confirmation gave her a sense of comfort and espousal. The corners of her lips were so very slightly moving up in warm and subtle motion. Apparently that was all she needed. He waited for her to stop making eye contact and took a sip from his coffee. It was the first sip after the second sugar. The hot liquid slid easily down his throat and reached his stomach with a suffusive heat. Do you want to go over the routine again? Not that I haven't memorized it or it's anything difficult, but for your own comfort, you know.
No, I think,
she said, looking down with a low yet confident tone.
I wrote everything about his routine and what he likes and doesn't. It's in the bag, too, with everything else. Also, you can call me with anything you want.
She sipped her coffee. The corners of her lips were raised again as she swallowed it and continued speaking.
I'll send you the fee with the mail every first day of the month.
He nodded. His hand grabbed around the cup after that in a nonchalant way. It was definitely warm still, though not warm enough, according to his instinct. The edge of his vision caught the lady lowering her head down so very slightly, but in such a way that it was telling of her emotions. Are you all right? He asked.
I know this isn't fair to ask, but that's why I want your honest opinion. Do not try to be kind, please. Do you think this is a bad thing to do?
He didn't want to answer the question, not because he thought it was a bad thing to do, but because the question was too naked. Reasons and purpose and many other things played gigantic factors in these kinds of things. But he was supposed to answer it, so he did. No, I don't think so, but I say that because you seem like a nice person. But if you want me to not be kind, tell me why you are doing this. She ran her hands over her face with enough pressure to make them yellowish in the process, then over her hair. She brought her hands back to her lap, swiped them to her knees, and answered.
Like I said, it was starting to become too much. My life started not becoming enough for me to be happy. Every day going the same. And seeing him like this, it just kills me, you know. And, of course, I can't even begin to image how he feels, or he has been feeling since his injury. But, you know.
She realized she was unpacking to a complete stranger, but the satisfaction and the healing was too much to deny herself it.
And worst of all, is that I have been taking it out on him.
She made eye contact again after saying that, as if wishing to be judged.
I'd yell at him for pissing himself, for not eating, not looking at me when I talk to him, and things like that. You know. Of course, I know it's incredibly stupid to expect him to act like a normal human being. But knowing isn't enough sometimes, you know?
She took a deep breath and shook her head very faintly, as if to say, I don't know. He entered his sentence with a calming, soft tone. You know, I said how I went down the same road that was with my father. He spent his last years in a wheelchair, and to see him like that just crushed me, just like you said. Because I looked up to him, you know. He was actually a professor.
What did he teach?
She asked with a genuine smile, unintentionally showing that she cared. Mathematics? Yeah, and he had a way, you know, with everything he did, he would somehow explain it to me with arithmetics. He just understood things. He was sounding more and more genuine as he talked more. She smiled to imply her request for him to continue. Yeah, and after everything, when he was paralyzed, everything changed for us. He paused for a bit. He was a different person, a whole nother someone I didn't know. He looked like he didn't understand anything I told him. I tried to tell him, and then the things you mentioned. Another pause, shorter this time. I would take my anger out on him. Everything, actually. The lack of his support, the way that he didn't want to share, the way he would look at me as if he was judging me, his sad eyes, which I took as ungrateful. Anything you could think of. It was heartbreaking for her to hear those, and it was even worse that she knew she wasn't going to change her mind. It was tough to admit, but it was the truth. But there was this one thing he had told me. I only realized this like an hour before he was dead. He told me an equation, dn by dt equals r, multiplied by n multiplied by 1 minus k to the current population size, n. The woman was expecting him to continue. I gave the same reaction when I first heard him explain it. It means the rate of change of the population size is equal to the intrinsic growth rate multiplied by the current population size, multiplied by 1 minus the ratio of the carrying capacity to the current population size. Same reaction again. Same as the man who was explaining it in the presence gave to the man who had explained it in the past to him. Which all means that environment shapes behavior. That's it. And that was... I looked at his eyes when I realized what that really meant, and it felt to me in that second that I was talking with the past version of him. He continued. Environment shapes behavior. For something as obvious as that was, I still needed him to understand it. It meant that it was okay. That environment shaped behavior. If you lived in a box for so long, either your or the box's behavior would change. The inside would change, regardless of inside. We talked about the human skull in that context. Then the human itself, the brain. And it's nothing any different for us. If you live in a wheelchair, your behavior will be according to that way of life. Their minds are different from ours. Ours is different from theirs. And that's okay. After they become this dependent, they become all our life, all our environment, and our behaviors change too. That. It's a simple rule of life, really. Some can continue for years. Some can continue their whole life. Both are all right. He paused for a second. Things change when we are alone and when we are not. You want to be alone because you want things to change? Like I said, that's completely normal. It's a part of life. Their eyes were looking at each other's, warm and understanding, wanting to smile. But it was unfair, wrong to smile at this. The reward itself was big enough.
What happened to him, if you don't mind me asking?
He took a bit before answering. Then, with his usual shy, slow tone, His brain was damaged because he was always on psychedelics in his late years. He started not walking, then I think forgot how to. Then one day he hit his skull and it was too much damage. He passed away.
I am very sorry.
Silence accompanied them for a while as they drank their coffees. It took a bit of time, then even more, for one of them to break the silence. Well, we should get going then, right? He asked without really expecting an answer.
Yes,
the woman said, looking down and also nodding her head with a confusingly unenthusiastic impression. Is he ready?
Yes.
She nodded affirmingly.
You finish your coffee. I'll go get him.
She hesitantly, but also not hesitantly, went out the door and turned left into the corridor. He watched her disappear, as the sound of her footsteps also did after a few extra seconds. His instincts sucked in a deep, stable breath, a smaller, less vocal one after that, and a more natural one after that one. They helped clear his mind and lowered his queer anxiety very quickly. How long was it going to take, though? He suddenly wondered after his anxiety perished sufficiently for him to do. It was feeling a lot longer than he anticipated already. The realization of that was coming to him only now. 2 or 3 minutes had already passed, right? Maybe. Not sure. It was probably the lack of dopamine and the outcropping anxiety that was making him feel like that. And the contrary could be more frightening. It was completely normal to carry the emotions he was carrying when it came to big things like this. Helping people in such grand ways could only be taken lightly by lesser people, or people without awareness, or at least in levels much lower than which he possessed. It's normal, of course, he muttered to himself. Out loud, he preferred speaking that way because it made him more conscious and alert. The warm color of his coffee attracted his eyes. As his eyes fixated on them, his mind started pondering, going to places of thoughts, random or formed intently with short lifespans. After the density of his numerous notions made it feel like for him that minutes had passed, he let go of the conceptions and took control of his eyes. With his command, they rolled around the place looking for sugar. Sugar like that on the kitchen counter. It took him less than 5 seconds to get there and less than 4 to get back, with 3 sugar cubes, right next to the table which had his coffee. He dropped the cubes into his cup one after the other and quickly crushed and mixed them. After the teaspoon kept flowing in a circle without any friction. In less than 5 seconds, with a half-grimacing face, he downed all the coffee. The lady came in slowly from the open door, pushing a man seemingly sleeping in a wheelchair.
He doesn't like traveling, so we took one of his sleeping pills,
she said as they stopped a step or two after the door.
He can take 3 a day without any danger. They are in his bag, in the small bin. I wrote sleeping pills on it, so you won't get mixed up. All of his stuff is labeled that way, and everything about them is written on the paper I told you about.
He stared at the man in the wheelchair for a few seconds after she finished. His focus got deeper and busier slowly, diving deeper into ideas and questions, answering most of them, and ignoring some, labeling those that are ignored as unnecessary in his own way. It was important to label things so you wouldn't get mixed up.
I guess this is it then.
She woke him up, not the man in the wheelchair, but the one who wanted more than 1, 2, 3, 4, or maybe even 5 sugars in his coffee. His response was not really anything else other than a copy. I guess this is it. He felt as though she was going for a hug, so he started walking to the door right away. The toll of a hug could be too heavy for him now. I could break down in front of her, he thought. He opened the door all the way. It was up all the way, the trunk. He closed it firmly after he was sure that the wheelchair was safe and stable in there. All right, he said. I think we are good to go, right?
I think so, yes. You are good,
she replied, still carrying that confusing, subtle smile. Okay, you take care. You can call me any time you want. He lifted the flip phone he was already holding in his left hand up to a level she could see. Any time, all right?
Yes. Thank you so much. Drive safe.
Thank you as well. Take care. He turned to the car and got in from the driver's seat side. The lady was in his peripheral vision, standing on the sidewalk, waiting for them to drive off. A deep and stable breath to slow things down and one last check of the seatbelt before he could speed things up. He reached down, after shutting the door behind him, to the paralyzed man's seatbelt with his palm to make sure it was clicked. And it was. He'll sleep for at least 2 hours, don't worry, she had said. The seatbelt was on, he was properly placed in the seat, and he wasn't going to move or put himself in harm's way in any way, shape, or form. Don't worry was right. Yes, it was. The car blew off a faint cloud of smoke and slowly left its subtle tracks on the road as they drove off from the house. She whispered behind them with her coffee on her hand, same smile on her face which was neglecting her eyes in some way.
Goodbye, my love. Be happy.
He stopped the car with extra attention on making it a soft stop. The lock clicked off. His hand went to the door latch to open it. Another click went off and he slowly got out. He shut the door behind him and went to the rear side to pop the trunk. He struggled to unfold the wheelchair for about a minute and felt terribly ashamed after he finally got it done. It wasn't hard to hear the sound of the friction of the wheels as they scraped the ground, continuing until to the point they were aligned with the front door. He was still asleep, leaning back into the seat in a slouch, with some oscillating apprehension behind his actions. He opened the door to get the paralyzed man onto his wheelchair. It wasn't particularly an easy thing to do, getting a paralyzed person into a wheelchair, which he immediately understood as soon as he realized he was standing there thinking about where to grab first. There was a difference between carrying someone in their sleep and when they were not in sleep, and he hadn't carried no one like that other than his father, and his father only once, whence he was emaciated anyway, even more than his guest. Those unexperienced instincts told him to grab him from his back, which he did. He lifted him up toward himself and locked his hands behind him. The paralyzed man's head immediately fell back as if to belittle him, accentuating his lack of expertise. That was the first successful thing in the last 3 minutes. He grabbed his head and placed it softly on his own shoulder. After that, he made another attempt at lifting him again. Nothing fell or insulted him this time, perhaps except his weak muscles that immediately started burning as he slowly and carefully sat the paralyzed man into the wheelchair. He stared. 3 long seconds. He began walking, pushing the man in front of him toward his house. Just walking, instead of standing and contemplating his situation, was definitely a smart move, he felt. Doing the opposite could have cost him weeks in the same spot, just waiting for a trigger to go off again so he could manage an attempt at doing the right thing. He did not remember how the first one had gone off and had pushed him into doing what he was currently doing. Nonetheless, he was grateful. Helping people on grand scales like this were not things to take lightly. It wasn't a bag you carried on your palms. Instead, like Atlas, a giant rock in the shape of the world, standing, crumbling the person underneath it who was holding it on his whole shoulders and back, with a great slump, a hunch. Environment shapes behavior. Just like his father had said, he had needed this, because all his environment were thoughts, and just thoughts shaping one's behavior wasn't optimal. Tangible and intangible were both essential to life, just like environment was tangible and behavior was intangible, though he also wished the otherwise. Thoughts being his environment, thoughts being tangible. He would have opened his skull and take out the thoughts if he could have. The door's frame put a stop to his thoughts. He took out the key and unlocked the door, opened it. His paralyzed guest was still asleep, which undeniably provided him with comfort. He pushed him inside, very, very slowly bumping him up from the threshold with intense care lest he woke up, then shut the door behind them, oscillating between locking it and not locking it. He did not. He checked if the man was still asleep, and he was. That was cause for a giant relieving breath. It came up into his chest, inflated it, and went out. Nice and stable intervals that are of relief and tranquility exuded around him. He walked to the coat rack, took out his coat, and hung it. He turned back to the wheelchair and his guest. Not a guest anymore, and grabbed the handles of the chair. He began pushing it towards the deep end of the corridor. He paused and looked at the stairs that went up to the second floor for a few seconds, which had no disabled lift. There was sunshine seeping from the door up at the end of the stairs. They continued deep into the corridor, which was the exact opposite. The sun wasn't even aware of that place. A dark rectangle hall with a door at the end of it, and another one right crosswise that went left, which was the storeroom. That was one of the reasons to why he had bought this house for a price cheaper than the rest of the houses on the market back then. Not much sunlight. They stopped in front of the door at the far end of the hall. He looked down carefully to check if he was still sleeping. Eyes closed, head slouched back, nostrils moving so very slightly but in stable intervals. His eyes went to the wheelchair, then moved along its frame, up to his own wrist, to check the clock. The gentleman's wake time was approximately still 30 or 40 minutes away. Eyeing once more, his focus rested on the man. What? Confusion popped a question in his mind. He promptly shifted down towards his guest, arranging his head in a more orderly manner. An unconscious nod to indicate his approval of the placement of the head, as if the paralyzed man wasn't paralyzed in the neck too, but still felt right to do so. He walked around the wheelchair and unlocked the storeroom's door. The room was a small square filled with gear and tools and fabric, pipes, wrenches, bolts, nails, scissors, few different-sized saws, a door at the end side, pills, extra clothes in a hang, a small sink, some basic kitchenware, and many other stuff. The wheels of the chair squeaked as he rolled him over inside, shutting the door behind them. He unbuttoned his shirt, removed it, and hung it to the hanger. One by one he went through the clothes with his palm, looking for the color he was waiting for. Blue, blue, orange, red, 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 blue, gray, black, black, oh yes, white. Finally, he put on the coat and washed his face 4 times. There was a clock at the wall, which helped in him understanding that 10 minutes had passed since they had come home. He walked to the door and unlocked it. An instant cold wave started infiltrating from the small gap, getting bigger and colder as the distance of the gap grew. He turned back to his guest, gripped the handles of the wheelchair, and they both walked in, making sure the door was shut but not locked behind them. He took and wore the hazard suit from the rack on the wall, slowly and carefully, a deep inhalation to clear his mind. The fog he had just blew onto the eye part of the suit slowly faded away. He watched it disappear, feeling the momentary comfort it brought him for some reason. Same watch as the last one inside the last door was here as well. 12 minutes since home. This place was so much smaller than the last one. There was a hanger on the wall with a bunch of hazard suits, a clock and nothing else, and the door he was staring at, of course, which was different than the last one. This one was reinforced steel with a password box on the wall it was attached to. He clicked the password and the door yelled a giant breath out that let out a white fog of cold. His hands latched onto the wheelchair again, and they went inside. After 10 seconds, the door shut by itself. There was a steel, somewhat clean and dirty stair going down. It had a disabled elevator. What's underneath the at least 200 meters of zigzagging stairs was a place dark and cold with very faint lighting. A huge space filled with not very much, but with some few steel desks, a computer at the desk which was placed a few meters after the end of the stairs, flasks of different substances, papers, a projector at the very high stone ceiling, and a gigantic, seemingly tactless and smooth black wall that was barely visible by the few overhead lights that were turned on to 5. There was a giant cavity in the middle of it. A big, half-circle, hollow cavity towards the inside of the wall, at least 3 meters into it, as if some giant thing took a perfect half-bite with a perfectly created sphere mouth. The top of the cavity was going all the way up to the ceiling, and the straight line at the bottom was right at level with the ground. It was a perfect half, 3 to 4 meters bent in hollowness. The cavity gave the sensation as if its color was the color of skin, but it wasn't. It was that grayish dark black like the rest of the wall. Some optical illusion of some sort, possibly constituted by the size of the wall, the lighting, the geometry of the cavity, and how the light hit it. He looked at his wrist watch again, as they finally hit the bottom of the stairs at the same time. 19 minutes. A disobedience of the feet to the brain. That was what was preventing him from walking. Seconds later, he realized that was false. His brain was the disobedient part. It was disobeying him. His eyes were fixated on the cavity with his hands on the handles of the wheelchair. 60 meters away from it, he felt as though he was right in the middle of it, feeling too self-aware to ignore that idea and ignore the sensation of the plastic on his palms. His pupils accrued, caused him into imagining as if they were attempting to fill the cavity. The chairs of the wheels started rolling with no sounds. The only sound in the place was the sound of beautifully smooth friction of the ground against the wheels. A somewhat loud sound was faintly roving in the whole of the place. It continued as they got closer and closer to the cavity. His hands gripped more firmly, trembling so very subtly with the movement of the wheelchair, the sensation of that soft tremble making itself felt on his throat and tongue and teeth, accompanying him on the very last meters on his road to helping people in great, great scale. The thought almost took him into a deeper hole to the point he was going to enter the cavity and bump into its end wall, but did not. He stopped the wheelchair a half-meter before it came, at the line of the cavity of the wall. They stood there for a few, then 5, 7, perhaps 10 seconds. He let go of his grip on the wheelchair and walked to the front of it. All right, muttering after. One of his hands grabbed the man from his waist and pulled him to himself. The other one placed the head on his own shoulder, then went right above the other hand. He lifted him up towards himself, muttering, grunting, fogging the eye line of the suit. It was incredibly cold. He had just realized, and somehow his muscles were burning. Another grunt. He turned back to the wall and took 1.5, 2, 3, 4 difficult steps. Another grunt, slow and long. That's when one of his knees popped as he went to kneel. Then a sounding low crack from his upper back. Nonetheless, indeed, he did continue. He took 2 steps back, stood there silently without being able to move his eyes from the cavity. His words waited in silence for a few seconds. A disappointment for not managing a basic sentence pushed out a ball of breath out of him, which sounded just as projective of his feeling. He tried again after running his hand through what was left of his hair, mostly scalp, and readjusting his mask and the mask's tubes. I wanted to do this by myself because seeking help, even rather informing the authorities, could have very well pushed things in different directions. Besides, it should be said that I also did not want my father's and my own life's work to be taken. It seems obvious to me that in this time of my career and research, as a scientist of cognitive understanding and consciousness, one of the most eminent areas which dominate our behavior and subsistence is the spikes of dopamine we process in pursuing things that are of troubling natures and in the same sentence, rewarding. He checked if the little square monitor 50-60 centimeters away from his torso was still recording him. The timer at the right top corner immediately answered his question. He continued, "The concept of dopamine, roughly speaking, happiness is no matter of question anymore. I think that could be said very fairly. Thousands of hours of research point to the fact I just stated as the basis of happiness. I am reflecting this already known phenomenon not with the purpose of explanation, but of one with only highlighting it, since it will help me a great deal in explaining the why of my seemingly ending project." Applying slight pressure, he covered his eyes with his palms, leaving a temporary redness over them for the next few seconds. A contrasting feeling appeared over them, and his eyelids as the cold contacted with them after he pulled his palms away. "This is test day 491. That is 491. My estimation for the solid resolution I was hoping to achieve, with the help of great names like William James, Francis Crick, Christoph Koch, David Chalmers, Giulio Tononi, Anail Seth, and many, many more who left a mark in history, past and present, for us. We do not have enough time in our hands to name all of these amazing people. My partner, my father too, of course. So I was saying that the estimation of resolution day, yes, my expectation was around the range of 545, which seems almost insanely, terribly, badly calculated. No matter. On the other hand, it makes me happy because, anyway, I shouldn't comment on personal matters in this section. The only constant is change. The reflection from the monitor stared at him as he did to it in the silence of the cold for a long second. That sentence. I will use that sentence to sort of explain my why in simple terms, in terms that are more open to empathy and logic at the same time. His head pensively went up, then down. That expression is but a hollow attempt at depicting the way our system functions. And hollow is right. Those black holes inside his eyes grew slowly when his vision turned into a stare into his own thoughts. Then he came back. I have a written document about this whole theory and work, obviously, but I feel the need to elaborate my opinions on the matter before documenting the work itself. I do not want this video to give anyone the wrong opinion because they were rushed into the idea of it. I will go on now. Hollow is right because, and fitting because it is absolutely correct. The why? Pensive, yet not so pensive nod. The why comes from the need of change. Our environment is constantly changing, which obligates that same constant change for us as well. It comes from the need for change. I can say gladly that this notion is both philosophically and scientifically proven in my documentation of the whole experiment. Of course, I should note that achieving the proof of something in philosophy is not really possible. My sentence stays in its basic statement only. Briefly to reference, for further purpose of simplifying my upcoming comments. Many, many experiments until now successfully show that the idea of, this is very important, the idea of change, and only the idea of change, not specifically a situation of change, but one that is just change as in the very general sense, seems to achieve the most activity in the VTA, the ventral tegmental area, when in meantime the usual observed levels of activity significantly, and I mean significantly reduce in the hippocampus, basically to none, which is, as we know, is responsible for its role in our memory. The crucial part here is the responsibility of the hippocampus and its crossing interaction with the mesolimbic pathway, which contains the VTA. This data shows us that the idea of the concept of change manages to achieve the pulling of an intrinsic trigger in ourselves that do not stem from memory but solely from instinct, not a pensive nod. This has been documented as well, of course. The whole video shows the extricating of a real skull in the brain of the human, further on showing the areas of the brain that quiver when the correlated and linked emotions it undergoes. Taking this into account, now I will return back to the topic of change and more. But first, the why. Stated in very basic terms, the why is just actually that instinct, that hole in us that calls for more, the hollow part of our humanity, which nonetheless guides us into not just terrible things, but great things as well. And so, and understanding is what separates us from the animals we eat. So, to have the chance to fill that hole with more... His head slowly slouched down. It waited there for a second, eyeing the desk under his elbows, then quickly gauging thoughts on how that meant something. The idea of a desk, an elbow placed on top of it, connected with a joint into the arm that reached all the way back up to him, who understood that that desk was a desk, meaning that it was an object meant to carry weight. Other objects and things on it, sometimes painted in tree colors of trees with holes, but not as big as the ones humans had. Still, so it could appeal to the value of nature held in humans, sneaky marketing. So to have that chance to fill that hole with more consciousness, to understand, know, and conceptualize and feel and grasp, was a chance that was, I think, granted by a wider than standard creation of consciousness in a human, and it would be the biggest waste of a human in the history of all humans. I am incredibly aware. Like a child born a mathematician, a child born an artist, a child born a construction worker. All this was achieved by taking the previous research into the next level, and my father's contribution. His calculations supported the theory that consciousness could be nothing but the perfectly placed formation of certain chemicals in the brain, and he had a great way of putting this. Environment shapes behavior. That's where he had jumped off to the theory. That and the psychedelics he would consume. Changing the chemicals of the brain alters the consciousness, son. Environment shapes behavior. Impossible to inspect the brain in the altered state. Impossible to see through the skull. Impossible to understand the environment. Things I saw. That thing. Giant. Black. Dark. More than 1,000 writings on it. 1,000 equations. All resulting the same. All proving the same. All proving not enough. Impossible to behave. He snapped out of it and continued his documentation. Consciousness isn't anything but the combination of chemicals that are at the perfect formation for life to be. And this will result in answering the most complex question of life and existence. Document 491 over. Next documentation will be 492. After getting out of the lab, the only path he could take was the one that led to his bedroom. The muscles in his brainstem were waning more and more. Things were becoming blurry, just as his thoughts were as well. He needed sleep and rest, so that 24 hours would pass faster, and he could continue with his experiment, and then record 492. A thing. Giant, black, titanic, covering all and else. Small source of light bloomed within it, in the middle of it, slowly causing awareness. The sun softly provoked his eyelids, slowly causing the blackness to disappear and his consciousness to form and become aware again. His eyes opened. After staring at the sunbeam coming in from the window, they shut themselves again, then opened again. The cobwebs faded away with slow-burning parts of awareness attending. His eyelids attempted shutting again, but he resolved to keep them open, doing so as well right away. It was obvious to him that he needed more rest, but he didn't like sleeping. He really didn't like it, especially the idea of it. He went to the bathroom and washed his face, put his glasses back, cleaned them, stared at himself in the mirror for a while. He puked out a handful of water, then cleaned himself. As a white figure looking sort of frozen before the lab door, he was contemplating whether to walk in or not. The idea of achievement was sort of scary now that it was close. His father would always ask him with intervals of a week or two so he could forget while they were working on consciousness, that if Fermat had felt as though he was done with the whole world after solving his problem in the last theorem. There was never really an expectance of an answer in those inquiries of his old man. They were more like as if he knew the answer, rhetorical questions. He never really got the opportunity to ask for the answer from his father until the time the answer had started attracting him. The only one who he could ask it was himself now. Will I be done with the world if this becomes successful? Was Fermat done with the whole world? He didn't know that. Maybe even Fermat didn't know that too. There laid another perspective that was yet again reflective of his situation, though. When Fermat proposed that he had solved the problem, no one had believed him. It had taken years and years and years for it to be proven. That was always incredibly strange to him. The thought would always freeze him on the spot, as he was doing now, and pull him into other thoughts and questions in his frozen stance. Even arithmetics were not reliable in queer cases. And to think that he had solved the complex structure of will and consciousness. The cold cloud of carbon dioxide burst into his hazard suit and misted his eye route. It waned with slow seconds, fading away in quick cold temperatures. He stepped in and the door shut behind him. Another burst of cold hit him right away, not on his body but inside. His eyes instantly began an attempt at running around the place, but he actively slowed down his excitement and haste. His right hand was slightly shaking, and his knees were feeling too light. Maybe that was because of the stairs which he walked down. Using the disabled lift didn't seem comfortable enough. With a quick snapping back of the mind, he removed all those distracting thoughts and went back to his observation. The lab, the newly, hopefully, chemical condition which he was afraid it might affect him beneath the hazard suit. Surely he was afraid, but not to an insane extent. He wanted to continue. The gaze took a mind of his own and started wandering around, eyeing all the corners and the objects and elements of the place as if the vision it possessed was a totem of feeling that would transcribe the visuals of what it was directed to into feelings to his commander's brain. The computer sitting on one of the steel desks which was staring at him from the very far end of the cold lab, the projection machine at the ceiling right above the stairs, the wall, then the metal desks scattered around. Flasks, tubes, glasses, salt, stains, alcohol, gas flasks, the cold, then cold of all of it. It was moving from one corner to other, losing more temperature as it moved around the place. The cold was getting to him. It was encouraging him to conclude his experiment, to take off the hazard suit, to check the chemical makeup of the room, to test it with his life. It was supposed to. He was supposed to conclude the experiment. That's why he is here. Whatever was going to happen had to happen. It had to. His stomach is wavering. It's obvious. Moving from one side to the other side. His stomach is as if it was trying to escape the cold. It needed to balance before he would take the hazard suit off, or he could puke and ruin things. It wasn't necessarily a proven possibility, but no, it needed to be balanced. It needed more balance. More balance so he wouldn't get mixed up. That's why you need balance, so you don't get mixed up. Also, everything placed that way so he doesn't get mixed up. That's why you label stuff, so you don't get mixed up. His stomach needs that. More of that. A deep breath went inside him and puffed up his chest. Another one went in from the nose, followed by another immediate one slowly departing from the mouth. That's it. Yes. Of course, his stomach needed that, more of that, but more means disregarding someone, something else, labeling less for them. What is more really like? What does it really mean? He thought as he was contemplating whether to take off the head part of his suit. It was a fair question before deciding to end a lifetime of work, be it success or failure, as long as it is an end in some fashion. His breaths are quite clear in the cold, maybe even loud enough to be heard. They were echoing, so the contemplation resumed after the distracting breaths. Quitting now? What would happen then? Another fair one, bigger one, in all honesty. The whole meaning behind pursuing responsibility. It was responsibility that gave meaning and tingled those dopamine kicks in the VTA and wherever. Leaving the job in the last episode of the project, where no responsibility was left, wouldn't give any contrast to the possible did the whole world end for him notion, and the cold supported this. It called for him, so he would continue in his pursuit of more consciousness, alteration for the good. A strange, thin, and high-pitched sound instantly touched all the space of the room as soon as the zipper in the back opened. Slowly, but then quickly with less intervals, echoes ran back to his ear, as if almost trying to induce him to the fact that he did, in fact, open the zipper. The last one entered both his ears, but there were so many of them in such a short amount of time that it had lost its meaning by then, failing to convince him that he had pulled the zipper down. Cold, though, however, did not waste any time in entering that window he just exposed. Yes, indeed, the zipper was open, he understood. Breathe, his brain told him. It's obvious. Which his brain was still at refusal. He was feeling small, and the fear of feeling even smaller was strengthening that refusal to breathe. He wondered how Fermat was feeling, at all times, like he was neglected by time and space. How was he feeling? The father knows. Not him. He looked around slowly, only with his eyes. This couldn't have been how Fermat had felt. He wanted to find out. So he turned around. The desks, the stairs, the flasks, the salt, alcohol, stains, the projection machine, the wall. The paralyzed man was gone. The paralyzed man was gone. There was liquid on the spot where he used to be. Looked like... The echo of his gag came back faster than the actual puke that jumped out of his mouth. It splashed to the floor and ran around until it stopped. His stomach felt better, but also didn't. He didn't know. It wasn't important. What was important then? It was the fact that he was now going to the stairs. He was walking toward the stairs. 1, 2, whatever, flasks, desks, light at the ceiling. He hoped it was at the ceiling still, because if he lifted his head up he would puke again. The computer, what else? Did it matter? It did not. The stairs were right in front of him, just like the disabled lift was. He got up at the disabled lift and pressed the fast button. The metal engineering work made a sound as if some gas or air escaped from it, very much like when the airlock door opened and started moving up in a speed he would not achieve. Not likely, it wasn't likely at all, actually, which he knew at least now, maybe not before. But no, he did know. He knew a lot of things like that. There were many examples, many of them. How puking in a cold room feels, the concept of awareness, the smell of salt, subtle white lights at the ceiling when they made direct contact with you and your skin, the cold of a steel desk, the burning fiber sensation caused by carrying a paralyzed man, the burning fiber sensation caused by carrying a not paralyzed man, desire for more change, the chilling iron handles of a wheelchair, the surface of bone, the smell of IQ and intelligence, sugar cubes, chaos, and how Fermat felt. His knees suddenly quit working and took him down, forcing him to puke at the spot between his hands, which he was forced to stand on as well as on his knees. The ideal place to puke would have been the next room, the storeroom, but this was all he could manage. After his gag stopped blocking the external sounds, he heard the door shut behind him. He realized he was puking for 10 seconds. I am okay. I am okay. Whispers started seeping out from his wet mouth. I am really okay. I am... Subtle gag cut his sentence, then faded away. I am aware, and I am okay. A big cloud of oxygen entered him, then another one after it. They departed out from his mouth. He repeated the same pattern. 2 quick ones from the nose, letting it go from the mouth. Slowly 1, 2, then away. He kept breathing like that for a while. Slowly broadening circles were giving birth to one and another in the cup. He didn't know what time it was, and that was quite well. The exact time didn't really matter for him at the moment. The sun was beaming into the kitchen, to his coffee, letting him know that it was morning, and that was good enough. He was thinking about Fermat again. There were stacks of ideas and feelings connected to each other about it. They weren't sufficient yet, though. Also, Fermat's theory was proven. It was documented. His wasn't. He had only realized now that his intention contained that particular aspect as well, as opposed to only succeeding in the experiment. The subconscious was slowly pushing a question to the surface of his mind. The question with the aim for the only part left to conclude the case. He had to go back in there. It became incredibly obvious as it reached the surface. That was one of the reasons, if not the biggest reason, why Fermat's solution was neglected for centuries. His flaw was that he hadn't provided a rigorous, a complete proof of his work. What he had presented was pages and pages of equations and solutions and concepts, but all in way of his subjective understanding and explaining, subjective explanations and wordings in the field of arithmetics. What did that tell him? Besides that he had to go in there and record the video, so he would also understand how Fermat felt after he was proved to be correct. Seemingly, it was that if his experiment was a success, the understanding scope of all was going to broaden, because his intention was the exact opposite of Fermat's flaw, which was showing the life out there the permanent fix for their flaws. He took a sip from his coffee as he was thinking about that thought. In contrary to the thought, surprisingly, his coffee was still warm. Perhaps the sunbeam was playing a part in that. He opened the kitchen cabinet and dove his hand around in there, fingering anything it touched, since the inside of the cabinet was basically a box with a shadow inside it, not at all bright, like the top of the counter. The fingers finally felt the sticky texture of the sugar cubes and locked a few between them. He took another sip, added the sugars, and kept drinking it. Then he puked, cleaned himself up, then prepared. A conversation about his dopamine levels and drive was happening between him and his brain as he was about to go down into the first floor from the second, using the stairs. There was no disabled lift here. Perhaps he was happy about that. Perhaps he wasn't. The conversation was stuck for the last 35 minutes in the same spot, and the first step he just took immediately erased it out of his mind. He realized how everything had become incredibly fast and slow at the same time for the last few days. It was chaos all over the place. What he had in mind at first was checking if the experiment was a success. And since it was a success, it was going to take care of its task by itself. That was it. All he had in mind. Understandably, that wasn't enough. 6 or 7 steps were already behind him now. The only constant is change. The sentence made a quick and random appearance in his mind as he took his next few steps. It was making an impression on him, providing some sort of proof, whether it was needed or not, about how it was quite the correct saying, even if it was hollow, as he had said. He was witnessing it, mostly about his feelings. They were changing and changing and changing. Another step down the stairs, then another with the other foot. What if the lift was here? What if there were no feelings in him? What if he had to use the lift? Was there any change in the paralyzed man's life at all for the last 10 or 12 years? What was constant for him other than just being? He picked up sort of a haste for the rest of the stairs, feeling good about the burning muscles in his legs, passing the sun, going deep into the hall and entering the storeroom, then entering the next, until he was about to enter the change room. The airlock door was staring right back at him, waiting to breathe a burst of cold breath onto him as he would enter the lab. The chill reoccurred at his spine as the consideration started encompassing his mind. Everything was changing, with the only exception of his growing appetite for accomplishing, doing more with the case. He looked at the coat hanger, the clock, then dismissed the both of them, the time, the hazard suits. Then his gaze went to the password for the airlock. Few slight touching sounds at the touchscreen. Then a bigger, much bigger sound, almost like a primal and odd roar from the doors opening. The place let out that giant, cold burst of breath. It was time to go in for more. He stepped into the cold cloud and instantly felt the chills and hairs rising on his body. It slowly roved around him, around the door, made a blur ball, playing with it until the door closed back. It made the same sounds they did as they closed. The cold fog started dissolving, gradually allowing him to see small parts of holes in it with his practically blinded eyes by the water they had quickly produced because of the cold. The holes of the fog connected one to another, then all to each other, and the giant ball of mist finally disappeared, handing the focus back to him alongside his vision. He blinked again. His vision cleared. The white of his eyes seemed bigger, just like his teeth, which was showing, because he wasn't aware that his mouth was open. In contrast to other, he wasn't aware at all. His bones felt rusty and thin. It was obvious. Any step could break them. Any force or more of anything at all could change them. Force chaos onto it. Most of it was gone. But he didn't notice. Most of it he wasn't aware of. His eye was at the giant wall straight in line with his eyesight, few hundred meters away, and his ears existed only for the sound he was hearing right now. This is test A 492. That is 492. The recording projection on the giant, smooth-textured and straight wall muttered. I am honored to announce that the project is more than successful. It exceeded the expectation and provided an incredible proof for the concepts and equations and the philosophy, as we humans like to call it, revolved around. The project ended in the same fashion it started, by tackling the hard problem of consciousness and how certain chemicals presented changes to it in our interest and case, without any external element. He was watching himself on the giant wall in a frozen motion, not moving any limbs, any muscles. His stomach was shaking. That was the only thing moving. Perhaps not even that. Maybe the room was shaking. It was about to collapse and destroy him underneath him. If it did, he wouldn't be able to move still. His legs, torso, fingers, and eyes were stationary, frozen. I didn't actually want to make this video at first. I was always thinking about how Fermat felt after succeeding, and after his theory was proved to be correct. But that wasn't what I wanted. I was wanting more from that. And this is that more. I digress. At the beginning of the project, we tested the brain to even widen our current understanding of it. And I can say that there were magnificent results, such as the one mentioned in one of the latter documentations, one about the pathways and dopamine and the response the brain gives to the concept of more. Then the test was continued with the testing of certain chemicals and their influence upon the brain. Of course, this was known for years, but we saw more and extended aspects about the effects of psychedelics and other lesser-known mixtures of chemical modificatory. This in the upcoming attempts and hundreds of hours of testing and problem-solving and dissecting. and most importantly, the physical action of disclosing a skull, went on to prove that indeed the consciousness wasn't anything but the strictly formed and shaped chemicals inside our brain. As was mentioned in the earlier documentation, when we managed to consummate the theory into mathematics, all resulting in the final fact that environment shapes behavior, tangible shapes intangible, which was documented and is documented as well. The end of our practice went very strict with this idea, pushed it into practice, and here we are. It's done. This is a success for the ages, for all time. I know how Fermat felt, and how cold feels, and how success feels, how everything and anything feels. I am incredibly aware of the scope of achievement this project has resulted in. I'm incredibly aware that nothing more could be the change this chaotic world needs. I also know the Father's answer to the question. Yes, I do. This is very important. Not talking about how Fermat felt, but what the Father thinks how he felt when there was nothing more for him to do after solving his problem. But that is irrelevant. The recording went away suddenly, leaving it all in the very, very dim white light the ceiling lights provided. But he was seeing. The man was seeing still. He was seeing the wall, not so far from him. To walk over there. His foot landed with a great sound echoing all over the space, as if it was a reaction from the ground itself. Then the other foot, following the step before, passing it, stopping. The wall, the cavity. He slurred the words inside his brain, continuing that, and the walking. What was his flaw again? Not him. Yes, what was his flaw? The mathematician. It was not being aware of how much proof the case had needed. Flaw. How hollow? Did they check the inside of his skull? No. His environment was of disbelievers. They shaped his behavior bad. Continuing, stepping, talking, feeling, the image came into his mind with that word. Hollow, right? His skull. His father's skull, and how hollow it felt when he had gotten out the brain to inspect it one last time before cleaning him up for the burial. The one he did with tears and screams of agony as his only company, that had needed a lot of stepping, talking, and feeling to get over. They shaped his behavior very bad, Fermat's. Father couldn't tell how he went around the village screaming to his colleagues about how they didn't understand him. Slowly reaching, walking on the cold surface, getting closer, how he became more and more irritable about the rising population number in the village, getting closer, reaching closer, understanding more and more, how they all didn't believe him. Then how he locked himself inside his room to clear his environment, stepping, talking, then stopping. And how he burned himself and all his notes except the one inside a glass box that said no more, stopping, right before the wall. Small. How small he looked before it. How less. He wondered as the ingratitude feeling immediately covered the surface of his thoughts. What is it that you want? He asked himself. What more? He is staring at it, leaning slightly forward to it, almost touching it with his face. He inquired it. His pupils reduced in size, becoming so much smaller than the sweat drops that were faintly forming under his scalp. Things felt different and changed. To look, to be aware. To look in the dark, to be aware in the dark. His body slightly moved forward, almost touching it, as if his curiosity was pulling him to it, or pulling it to him, or pulling it to it, or just pulling, getting closer. Stepping, feeling, talking closer. What more do you want? His desire urged him to ask himself again. What more do you want? He knew. Closer and closer, almost touching. I don't see the point in killing you. I feel the exact opposite. The sound echoed in the whole of the room in return. There is no projection working, no computer open. I see the full point in going into cavity. The man raised his head in a confused state. Up. The ceiling light suddenly grew brighter, luminous, glorious, alive. The light fell down onto him, growing and spilling like... It spilled with its sudden, unexpected luminosity, sliding from the wall, from the air, unto him and the ground, covering everything in blinding white brilliance. Alive, staying alive, shining, touching places, things, the human, for seconds. It kept shining more, shining more, suddenly spilled into a hollowness, into a cavity inside the wall, like a tangible idea diving into a skull, bright and blinding, then disappeared, only leaving the whole lab with its corners and the same black, tactless, smooth and straight black wall. No equations written on it, just environment and behavior, nothing more.